Northern Montana, January 1891. Nobody noticed what was happening inside that limestone cavern 3 miles west of the settlement. From the outside, it looked abandoned, just another dark mouth in the hillside that trappers and hunters passed without a second glance. But inside, while neighbors huddled around failing fires in their cabins, burning through cords of wood just to keep frost off the walls, one woman had created something different. Something that would rewrite what the community thought possible about winter survival. What did she understand about thermal physics that experienced builders missed? Today, you're going to see how a quiet solution, built without fanfare, without permission, without proving anything to anyone, became the most copied design in 3 counties. And it started with a decision most people called foolish. Hit that subscribe button right now, because every week I bring you one real technique that worked when survival depended on it. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I want to know who's part of this community learning forgotten wisdom. Let's go back to the winter that changed everything. Her name was Marion Hewitt, 32 years old, widowed 8 months earlier when her husband drowned crossing the Milk River during spring melt. She had 2 children, a daughter of 9 and a son barely 6, in a cabin with a stone chimney that leaked smoke when the wind came from the north, which was most of the time. Marion worked as a seamstress, taking in mending and making shirts for the loggers who came through town. The pay was enough for flour and salt pork, but not enough for the 12 cords of wood her cabin needed each winter. The previous year, she'd burned through 9 cords and still woke to ice on the inside of the windows. Her children slept in layers of wool, breath fogging even under the blankets. She needed a solution. Not a perfect one, just one that worked. The cavern sat in a limestone ridge west of town, mouth facing southeast, sheltered from the prevailing winds by a stand of Douglas fir. Marion had noticed it years earlier while foraging for chokecherries. The opening was narrow, maybe 8 feet across, but the chamber inside widened to nearly 20 feet. The ceiling rose to 12 feet at the center, tapering down toward the back wall 40 feet in. Most importantly, it was dry. Water seeped through fissures near the entrance during heavy rain, but the back stayed consistently moisture-free. The stone was dense, cold to the touch even in summer. Marion had read enough to know what that meant. Thermal mass. The settlement had no shortage of opinions about proper housing. Cabins were supposed to be built with square corners, plank floors, and chimneys that drew cleanly. Living in a cave wasn't just unconventional. It was seen as a step backward, something desperate people did before they could afford real walls. Marion didn't care what it looked like. She cared whether her children would wake up warm. In late September, she began hauling materials to the cavern. Rough-cut lumber from the sawmill's discard pile, clay from the riverbank, flat stones from a collapsed homestead foundation, dried moss and pine pitch. She worked in the early mornings before her sewing, and on Sundays after church when the children could play nearby. She wasn't building a house. She was building a shelter inside a house that nature had already insulated with 60 feet of limestone. The cavern's natural protection was significant, but not enough. Marion understood that cold air sinks and warm air rises, basic physics. But she also knew that bare stone pulls heat away through conduction. Her body heat, her children's warmth, even the heat from a fire would bleed into those walls unless she created a barrier. So she built a room within the cave, starting 15 feet back from the entrance, where the ceiling height was still generous. She constructed a rectangular frame using salvaged lumber. The dimensions were modest, 14 feet long, 10 feet wide, 8 feet high, tight enough to heat efficiently, large enough for 3 people to live without crushing each other. The outer walls of this inner room weren't solid wood. They were double-layered. She set the first wall of vertical planks, gaps chinked with clay and moss. Then, 12 inches outward, she erected a second wall. The space between became a dead-air chamber, insulation that cost nothing but labor. She filled the gap partially with dried grass and pine needles, materials that trapped air pockets and slowed heat transfer. The floor was equally deliberate. Marion laid flat stones directly on the cave floor, creating a thermal battery. Above that, she built a raised plank floor with a 4-inch gap. Cold air from the cave floor would settle below the planks, while the living space stayed separated. For the ceiling, she used the same double-layer principle. Boards covered with a layer of canvas salvaged from an old wagon cover, then more boards above that. Heat rising from the living space would warm the ceiling, but the air gap would prevent it from escaping into the cold upper reaches of the cavern. The entrance to this interior shelter faced away from the cave mouth, oriented toward the back wall. Marion built a small vestibule, a 5-foot passage that created an airlock. Cold drafts from outside would hit the outer wall and lose momentum before reaching the inner door. At the back of the shelter, against the deepest wall of the cavern, she positioned her heat source. Not a fireplace with a chimney racing heat straight outside. A masonry stove. She'd seen one in a German homesteader's cabin 2 years earlier and understood immediately why it worked. The firebox was small, built from salvaged fire bricks she'd traded 2 months of mending to acquire. The smoke and heat didn't vent straight up. They traveled through a serpentine path of stone and clay channels that radiated warmth into the room for hours after the fire died. The chimney exited through a carefully sealed gap in the cavern's ceiling, using natural fissures she'd widened with a hand chisel. The draft was strong enough to pull smoke cleanly, but the heat stayed captured in the stone mass before escaping. She lined the back wall, the cavern's natural limestone, with an additional layer of flat river stones mortared with clay. This became a radiant wall, absorbing heat from the stove and releasing it slowly. The stone held warmth long after the fire reduced to coals. Marion calculated, roughly, instinctively, that the entire system gave her 4 sources of retained heat: the masonry stove itself, the radiant back wall, the stone floor, and the limestone cave wall beyond. Layers within layers. Mass holding energy that would otherwise vanish up a chimney or bleed through thin walls into the Montana wind. It wasn't elegant. It didn't look like the cabins in town. But thermodynamics doesn't care about appearances. She finished construction in early November, just as the first hard freeze arrived. Marion moved her children into the cave shelter on November 9th, 1890. The transition was simple: blankets, a table, 2 chairs, a trunk of clothes, cooking pots, and her sewing supplies. Everything fit. The space felt smaller than the cabin, but warmer immediately. She burned her first fire in the masonry stove that evening. 3 split logs, not the armload her cabin fireplace had demanded. The smoke drew cleanly through the channels, venting outside without backflow. Within an hour, the interior temperature rose to 62 degrees Fahrenheit, measured by a mercury thermometer she'd kept from her father's surveying kit. The children slept without shivering. Marion could sew by firelight without wearing gloves. Word spread, as it always does in small towns. The reactions were predictable. Most people didn't say anything to her face. Marion was a widow, and direct cruelty would have violated the community's sense of decency. But the comments circulated anyway. Living in a cave like animals. What kind of mother raises children in a hole in the ground? That stone's going to weep moisture all winter. They'll catch pneumonia. A carpenter named Eugene Stroud, who'd built half the cabins in the settlement, made his opinion clear at the general store. I've been framing houses for 20 years. You don't put people underground. It doesn't circulate, mold sets in, and when spring melt comes, that whole ridge will seep. She's going to flood out or suffocate, and those kids are going to pay for her stubbornness. Others were less harsh, but equally skeptical. A trapper passing the cavern entrance in late November saw smoke rising from the fissure and stopped to investigate. Marion explained what she'd built. He listened politely, then said, "Seems like a lot of work when you could have just stacked the cabin walls with sod like the Norwegians do." She didn't argue. There was no point. The schoolteacher, a woman named Constance Merrill, visited in early December under the pretense of checking on the children's well-being. She stepped in the vestibule, felt the warmth, and saw the neat interior, clean, dry, orderly. Her expression softened slightly, but her words were cautious. "It's warmer than I expected. But Marion, you understand people are concerned. This isn't conventional." "Conventional wasn't keeping us warm," Marion said. Constance nodded slowly. "Just be careful. If anything goes wrong, the town will remember you chose this." Marion accepted the warning without resentment. She knew how judgment worked. People needed to see failure before they'd accept unconventional success. Until then, she was just the widow who'd made a strange choice. She kept working, sewing during the day, managing the stove in early morning and evening. The routine was simple. Load 3 logs at dawn, let the mass hold heat through the day, load 3 more at dusk. The stone radiated warmth through the night. She woke fewer times to tend the fire than she ever had in the cabin. By mid-December, she'd burned through less than a quart of wood. In the cabin, she would have used 3 by that point. Nobody asked about her wood consumption. They assumed she was burning through her supply and would run out by February, proving the critics right. Marion didn't correct them. She just kept the fire small and the door closed. The cold arrived on January 6, 1891. It wasn't a gradual descent. The temperature dropped 28 degrees in 6 hours, driven by an Arctic front that poured down from Canada and stalled over the northern plains. By midnight, the mercury hit 18 below 0 Fahrenheit. By dawn, 26 below, and it stayed there. January 1891 became the coldest month anyone in the settlement could remember. The oldest residents compared it to the winter of 1846, stories their parents had told. Livestock froze in their pens, well sealed with ice. The river became a solid highway of white. For the first week, people managed. Cabins were built for Montana winters. Thick walls, heavy stoves, stockpiled wood. But this wasn't a normal cold snap. This was sustained, brutal, relentless. The wind didn't stop. Every crack in a wall became a thermal leak. Every chimney became a conduit for heat loss. Wood consumption doubled. Families who'd planned for 12 cords suddenly faced the possibility of running out. The price of firewood tripled. Men who'd sold their surplus in December were now rationing their own supplies. Chimneys that had drawn cleanly for years began backdrafting. The extreme cold created temperature inversions, trapping smoke and pushing it back into cabins. Families woke choking. Some slept outside their homes, near external fires, risking frostbite to escape suffocation. The Gunderson family, living in a well-built log cabin a mile south of town, burned through 8 logs before breakfast just to keep the temperature above freezing. Their children slept in a huddle with hot stones wrapped in cloth pressed against their backs. Mrs. Gunderson told a neighbor, "We're going through a cord every 4 days. We won't make it to March." Eugene Stroud, the carpenter who'd criticized Marion's cave, had his chimney crack from thermal stress. A stone liner split during a particularly cold night, and smoke poured into his main room. He had to abandon the fireplace entirely and rely on a small iron stove, which barely kept one room livable. People stopped visiting each other. Leaving home meant losing heat. Every open door was a tax on survival. Stay with me, because you're about to see the number that stunned the entire settlement. On January 19th, 13 days into the deep freeze, the settlement's lay pastor, Reverend William Colfax, made his rounds checking on vulnerable families. Marion was on his list, a widow with 2 children living in conditions people assumed were marginal at best. He approached the cavern entrance, expecting to find desperation. Instead, he found something else entirely. Reverend Colfax noticed the smoke first, or rather, the lack of it. Every cabin in the settlement had a chimney pumping steady columns of gray-white smoke, burning wood as fast as families could split it. The fissure above Marion's cave emitted a thin, intermittent wisp, barely visible against the overcast sky. He stepped closer to the entrance, expecting the bitter cold to intensify near the stone. Instead, the air felt different, calmer. The wind that scoured the hillside seemed to slide past the cave mouth without penetrating. He called out. Marion appeared from the vestibule, wearing a wool dress, but no coat, no shawl. Her children were behind her, playing with carved wooden animals. Neither child was bundled in layers. "Reverend," she said, nodding, "come in if you'd like. Close the outer door behind you." He stepped into the vestibule and immediately felt the shift. The temperature wasn't just warmer, it was stable. No drafts, no cold spots. He moved through the inner door into the main shelter. The thermometer on the wall read 82 degrees Fahrenheit. Colfax stared at it. That can't be right. It's been between 78 and 84 for the past week, Marion said. She gestured to the masonry stove. I burned 3 logs this morning. That'll hold until tonight. The Reverend walked to the stove and placed his hand near it. The surface was warm, but not scorching. Nothing like the roaring iron stoves in town that glowed red and still barely kept rooms at 50 degrees. He looked at the walls, the double-layer construction, the stone floor radiating gentle heat. How much wood are you using? About 2 logs a day. Sometimes 3 if I'm cooking something that needs sustained heat. Colfax did the math in his head. 2 logs a day meant roughly a cord every 2 months. Maybe 6 cords for the entire winter. Most families were burning that in a month during this cold snap. He asked the question that mattered. How long does the heat last after the fire dies? Marion walked to the stove and opened the firebox. The coals inside glowed faintly, minimal flame. This fire's been going for 6 hours. I'll add 1 log before bed tonight, and the stone will keep the room above 70 until morning. I'll let the fire go out completely before the temperature drops to 65 over about 8 hours, then holds there. 65 degrees with no fire, in weather that was sending families into hypothermic desperation. Colfax turned slowly, taking in the design. The radiant back wall, the insulated double walls, the thermal mass of stone beneath and around everything, the airlock entrance, the serpentine stove channels. How did you know to build it this way? I didn't invent any of it, Marion said. Masonry stoves are German. Double walls are standard in root cellars. Stone floors hold heat in every old barn. I just put the pieces together and let the cave do the work. The Reverend nodded slowly. He was a practical man, not given to exaggeration, but he understood immediately what this meant. Marion hadn't just survived the cold. She'd beaten it with a fraction of the resources everyone else was burning through. People need to see this, he said. They're welcome to visit, Marion replied. I'm not hiding anything. Colfax left and went directly to Eugene Stroud's house. The carpenter was feeding his iron stove, the room temperature hovering around 48 degrees despite the fire roaring. You need to see Marion Hewitt's shelter. Stroud looked up, irritated. I'm not interested in hearing about cave living, Reverend. She's maintaining 80 degrees with 2 logs a day. Stroud stopped mid-motion, log in hand. That's not possible. I saw the thermometer. I felt the heat. She's burning 1/10 of what you're using and staying twice as warm. Within 2 days, a dozen people had visited the cave. Not everyone, pride and stubbornness kept some away, but enough to spread the word. Each visitor saw the same thing. A small fire, massive retained heat, minimal wood consumption, and 3 people living comfortably while the world outside froze. The numbers were undeniable. Average cabin temperature during the cold snap, 45 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit, achieved by burning 6 to 8 logs per day. Marion's cave shelter, 78 to 84 degrees, burning 2 to 3 logs per day. Heat retention after fire died. Cabins dropped below freezing in 2 to 3 hours. Marion's shelter held above 65 for 8 hours or more. Wood consumption comparison. Neighbors were using 3 to 4 cords per month. Marion used half a cord. The differential wasn't marginal. It was a completely different thermal reality, happening 30 feet from the same wind, the same cold, the same January sky. People started asking questions. Not defensive questions, but genuine ones. How thick were the walls? What kind of stone worked best for the floor? Could the masonry stove design be adapted to a cabin? Marion answered everything. She had no proprietary secrets, no interest in gatekeeping. The knowledge worked because physics worked, not because she discovered something mystical. By late January, 3 families had begun modifications to their homes. A trapper named Simon Voss insulated his cabin's north wall with a double-layer system, packing the gap with dry moss. His interior temperature rose by 12 degrees with no additional wood. A homesteader named Abigail French rebuilt her fireplace into a simple masonry heater using river stones and clay. Her wood consumption dropped by 40%, and her children stopped waking up cold. The carpenter, Eugene Stroud, visited the cave on February 2nd. He didn't apologize. Pride wouldn't allow that. But he asked detailed questions about the stove channels and the airlock vestibule. Marion showed him everything. 2 weeks later, Stroud built a modified version for a client, incorporating thermal mass and double-wall insulation in a new cabin. The client reported it was the warmest structure he'd ever lived in. The shift was quiet, organic. No speeches, no formal adoption. Just people recognizing that survival mattered more than convention. Spring arrived in late March, and with it came the accounting. The winter of 1890 to 91 had killed 11 people in the surrounding counties. Most from exposure, 2 from cabin fires started by desperate attempts to generate heat, 1 from smoke inhalation when a chimney collapsed. Livestock losses were catastrophic. Several families abandoned their homesteads entirely, retreating to larger towns where communal resources could sustain them. In the settlement near Marion's Cave, no one had died, but the toll was visible. Families had burned through wood reserves they'd expected to last 2 winters. Some had dismantled sheds and fences for fuel. The economic damage would take years to recover from. Marion Hewitt had used 4.5 cords of wood total. She had 3 cords remaining from her original supply. The difference wasn't lost on anyone. By April, the cave shelter had become a point of pilgrimage. Not in any formal sense. No one organized tours or wrote articles, but in the organic way knowledge spreads when survival depends on it. People came to see, to ask questions, to understand what they dismissed as foolishness 5 months earlier. A Norwegian homesteader named Karina Bjornstad visited in early April with her husband. They'd survived the winter in a sod house that had leaked meltwater and lost heat through the earthen roof. Karina walked through Marion's shelter slowly, touching the double walls, examining the masonry stove, measuring the vestibule dimensions with a length of rope. "This is smarter than anything we built in Trondheim," she said quietly. "We thought sod was enough. We were wrong." Her husband asked about adapting the design to an above-ground structure. Marion sketched modifications on a piece of slate. How to create thermal mass with a stone floor, how to insulate walls with air gaps, how to position a masonry stove for maximum radiant benefit. 2 months later, the Bjornstads rebuilt their home using Marion's principles. Their first winter in the new structure, they burned 60% less wood than before and maintained interior temperatures in the low 70s even during cold snaps. The technique spread unevenly, as practical knowledge always does. Some people adopted the full system, double walls, masonry stoves, stone thermal mass. Others took pieces, adding insulation layers, repositioning fireplaces, building vestibule entries to reduce drafts. A rancher named Clayton Hodge couldn't modify his existing cabin structure, but he built a small masonry heater in his barn using Marion's design. The structure kept his horses comfortable through the next winter and reduced his fear of livestock death by freezing. The schoolteacher, Constance Merrill, incorporated the double-wall principle when the town built a new schoolhouse in 1892. The building stayed warm enough that children could remove their coats indoors, something unheard of in the old structure. Firewood costs for the school dropped by half. Even Eugene Stroud, the carpenter who'd been most vocal in his skepticism, became an unlikely advocate. Not publicly, his pride prevented open admission, but practically. Every cabin he built after the winter of 1891 included some version of Marion's innovations. Thicker walls with insulation layers. Masonry heaters instead of open fireplaces. Stone floors in key rooms. Vestibule entries. When clients asked why the designs had changed, he'd say, thermal efficiency, basic physics. He never mentioned Marion by name, but the influence was unmistakable. By 1895, 4 years after that brutal winter, an estimated 37 homes and structures within a 50-mile radius had incorporated techniques derived from Marion's cave shelter. The changes were subtle enough that no one cataloged them as a movement, but the impact was measurable. Average winter wood consumption in the area dropped by an estimated 28%. Families reported fewer illnesses related to cold exposure. Children slept through nights without waking from shivering. The small, Incremental improvements in daily comfort represented a fundamental shift in how people approached thermal survival. Marion herself never treated the shelter as anything revolutionary. She lived in the cave for 6 more years, until her children were grown and she could afford a small house in town. The structure she built, timber, double-walled, with a masonry stove and stone floor, was modest but warmer than anything she'd lived in before. The cave remained as she'd left it. Occasionally, a trapper or hunter would shelter there during storms, finding the interior still dry, still protected by the layers Marion had installed. The double walls weathered well. The stone floor remained intact. In 1903, a geologist from the University of Montana visited the area to study limestone formations. A local guide showed him Marion's cave shelter as a curiosity. The geologist measured the interior temperature on a December afternoon. No fire, no recent occupation, and recorded 51 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside temperature was 19 degrees. The cave, with its thermal mass and insulated interior, was still holding heat 12 years after Marion had stopped living there. The rock remembered. The geologist wrote a brief note in his field journal. Ingenious use of natural thermal properties. Occupant understood heat retention better than most engineers. He didn't record Marion's name, but the knowledge remained, embedded in the structures people built, the modifications they made, the quiet understanding that warmth wasn't about burning more wood. It was about keeping the heat you generated. By the time Marion died in 1924, at the age of 65, the settlement had transformed. Homes were tighter, better insulated, more thermally efficient. Masonry stoves were common. Double-wall construction was standard for anyone building seriously. No one gave speeches about her contribution. There were no plaques or commemorations. The changes had been absorbed so completely into local building practice that their origin faded from collective memory. But every family that stayed warm through a Montana winter, every child who slept without shivering, every neighbor who burned half the wood they'd once consumed, they were living inside the logic Marion had demonstrated. The cave stood silent on the hillside, its entrance still visible through the Douglas fir, its interior still holding the ghost of heat from fires long extinguished. Thermal mass doesn't forget. Stone remembers warmth the way water remembers its path. And somewhere in the bedrock of that ridge, in the molecular structure of limestone that had held a family safe through the coldest winter in 45 years, Marion's understanding remained. Not as tribute, but as physics. Permanent. Provable. True. Marion Hewitt didn't invent thermal mass, masonry stoves, or insulated walls. She didn't discover new laws of physics or pioneer revolutionary technology. What she did was simpler and harder. She listened to what the materials were telling her. Stone holds heat. Air trapped between walls slows thermal loss. Small fires burned in dense mass radiate longer than large fires vented straight to the sky. Caves provide natural insulation that humans spend fortunes trying to replicate. The principles were ancient. The application was personal. The results were undeniable. In a world that often mistakes complexity for intelligence and convention for wisdom, Marion's shelter stands as a quiet rebuke. Survival doesn't require the newest materials or the most expensive systems. It requires understanding how energy moves, how heat behaves, how simple barriers and mass can transform a frozen hole in the ground into a place where children sleep warm. The winter of 1891 tested everyone. Most people fought it with brute force, more wood, bigger fires, thicker walls that still leaked heat. Marion worked with the cold instead, creating layers and mass that turned physics into comfort. 82 degrees inside, while the world froze outside. Half the wood, double the warmth. Not through magic, but through respect for how heat actually works. The techniques she demonstrated didn't die with her. They're still alive, in the way people position stoves, in the way they insulate walls, in the understanding that thermal mass matters more than flame size. And the cave? It's still there, still dry, still holding temperature the way it did when Marion first recognized its potential. The limestone doesn't care who gets credit. It just keeps doing what rock does absorbing, holding, releasing, reliable, patient, warm. If you found this valuable, hit that like button and subscribe, because every week I'm bringing you real techniques from people who survived when everything depended on getting it right. Drop a comment below. Where are you watching from? And what's the coldest winter you've ever faced? I want to hear your stories. The past isn't primitive. It's practical. And sometimes the wisest thing we can do is listen to what the stone already knows. Educational note. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific events are fictional, while the techniques, concepts, and principles discussed are based on real historical practices and well-established physical or practical knowledge. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current standards, safety guidelines, and applicable laws or regulations. This content is educational in nature and does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.